Today, we're tackling a huge idea, one that has literally shaped empires and started wars for centuries, the balance of power. So the big question is this just some dusty old concept from a history book, or is it still the invisible hand guiding how countries deal with each other right now? Let's get into it. So let's just start with a really basic but really big question. In a world full of powerful, ambitious countries, what's to stop one of them from just getting so strong that it can push everyone else around and dominate the whole planet? For hundreds of years, the answer wasn't some international law. It was more like a powerful, unwritten rule of the game. And that rule is the balance of power. The easiest way to think about it is like a classic set of scales. If one country or alliance starts getting way too powerful, piling too much weight on one side, other nations will naturally start teaming up, adding their own weight to the other side to bring it all back to equilibrium. Now, this isn't about creating world peace or anything like that. It's about creating a system where launching a war of conquest is just too risky, because you know for a fact that other powers will check you and balance you out. To really get what this is all about, we've got to travel back in time to its golden age. This was a period when the balance of power wasn't just a theory you read about, it was the literal operating system for how politics worked across the globe. You can trace the idea all the way back to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. That's what really created the independent states that became the main players in this global balancing act. But the real peak was the 19th century, right after the Napoleonic Wars. At the Congress of Vienna, all the leaders of Europe sat down and deliberately engineered a balance of power to make sure no one like Napoleon could ever run wild again. But here's the catch. This delicate dance eventually turned into a rigid standoff. By the early 1900s, you had two massive, armed-to-the-teeth alliances staring each other down, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. The system wasn't flexible anymore. It was a tripwire, and that tripwire led straight to World War I. And what's so fascinating is that this wasn't something that just happened on its own. Nope. Nations were actively, deliberately working to keep this balance. They had a whole playbook, a whole toolkit of strategies they used to keep those scales from tipping too far one way or the other. So what was in this toolkit? Well, the most obvious one, alliances. If a rival was getting too strong, you'd form a counter-alliance to match their power. Then you had the classic arms race, building up your military so no one would dare mess with you. Countries would also jump in to protect a weaker state if a stronger one was trying to gobble it up. They'd even create these buffer states, basically neutral countries sandwiched between big powers to keep them from fighting directly. And of course, there's the age-old strategy of divide and rule, making sure your competitors are too busy squabbling with each other to threaten you. All right, so this system pretty much ran the show for a long, long time. But let's be real, the world today looks nothing like 19th century Europe. Which leads to the big question, has the whole idea just become obsolete? I mean, if this was the bedrock of international politics for so long, why do so many smart people argue that it's completely irrelevant today? The answer is that the 20th century didn't just shuffle the players around, it completely flipped the game board over. See, the classic system worked because you had a bunch of major players, Britain, France, Prussia, Russia. It was a multipolar world. They could shift their alliances, team up with different partners, and keep things flexible to maintain that equilibrium. But then World War II happens, and after the dust settles, you're left with just two giants standing, the USA and the USSR. This created a rigid bipolar system. You were either on one side or the other. There was no one else to team up with. The scales were basically frozen in place. And on top of that, a whole bunch of new factors came along and just shattered the old rules. First, you have nuclear weapons, which basically made an all-out war between the superpowers a suicide mission. Then you had this massive ideological clash, capitalism versus communism, that often mattered more than a country's simple national interest. You also saw the rise of the United Nations, which offered this new idea of collective security instead of just states balancing each other. And critically, there was no independent balancer, no country like 19th century Britain that could stay on the sidelines and jump in to tip the scales back whenever needed. So yeah, the case for this idea being obsolete, it's pretty compelling. But, and this is a big but, that is not the end of the story. There's a really strong counter-argument that says the balance of power never actually went away. The idea here is that, okay, maybe the methods and the players have changed, but that core instinct, that gut reaction that countries have to balance against a rising power, that has not disappeared, not at all. You just have to look a little closer to see it working. Remember how we just said that the bipolar world of the Cold War made this whole idea obsolete? Well, here's the twist. The counter-argument is that the end of the Cold War is what actually brought it roaring back. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've seen the rise of new powers, right? China, India, a more unified European Union. This has pushed us back into a multipolar world. And a world with lots of competing powers and shifting alliances, well, that starts to look a whole lot more like the 19th century than the Cold War, which makes the logic of balancing more important than ever. And the reason this basic logic still holds up is because the fundamental building blocks of world politics haven't really changed. Power is still the main currency, and nations are always going to try to manage it. Sovereign states, they're still the main actors on the world stage. And with the end of the big ideological fight of the Cold War, we're back to countries acting on their own practical national interests. Some people even argue that the US, as the world's only superpower for a time, has kind of taken on that balancer role, shifting its weight around to counter threats wherever they pop up. So we've heard both sides of the argument. Where does that leave us? Is the balance of power just an antique concept we study in history class, or is it an active force shaping our world right now? Well, the truth, as it usually is probably somewhere in the middle. There's a great quote from the political scientists Palmer and Perkins that kind of nails it. They said the concept is still meaningful, even if it's lost much of its validity. It was born from the nation-state system, right? So as long as we still have that system, some version of this balancing logic is probably going to stick around. So what's the final verdict? Here it is. The old-school playbook from 19th century Europe with the specific tools and methods? Yeah, that's probably gone for good. But that fundamental instinct, that deep-seated, almost gravitational pull for nations to team up and push back against any single power that gets too big for its britches, that remains one of the core drivers of everything that happens in world politics. And that leaves us with a huge, critical question for our time. In a world where power isn't just about armies and navies anymore, it's about cyber warfare, economic influence, and global challenges like climate change, you have to wonder, who is going to be the next one to tip those scales? And when they do, how will the rest of the world react to restore the balance?